Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo, Burja, and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in.
Let's get into the immigration discourse because there's a lot going on and a lot to sort of disentangle in the conversation. So there's sort of and people typically separate this out into skilled immigration and unskilled, so to speak. So when we have you open with your high level thoughts on making sense of the discourse and understanding what's happening.
Yes, I mean, at a very basic level, even the terms of the debate sort of define what people consider a desirable outcome. Any focus on explicitly, say, illegal immigration is already granting the premise that immigration is desirable. Any focus on skilled immigration already, for example, presupposes that the main value of immigration is sort of benefit of the existing citizenry. And, any sort of, full immigration moratorium at this point is probably focusing primarily on the question of whether or not we can even control the bureaucracies overseeing immigration. So let's go into this a little bit more deeply, right? If we sketch this out, this discourse constantly changes, right? And people often, just by talking about it one way or another, presuppose a desired outcome. I think one fundamental truth on this topic is that economists are not value neutral and not objective on the question of immigration. What do I mean by this? The vast majority of economists have a pre-commitment to sort of a neutrality as to where wealth is produced. They're always thinking about sort of the entire global population and what is best for wealth production around the world. And also view immigration as, in a way, a useful corrective or a good redistribution from developed societies to less developed societies. It's completely undeniable that the life of individuals are vastly improved if they go from a very impoverished country to a developed country. What is being debated is what is the economic value produced there? And I think on a basic level, economists don't care about the reality because they have these pre-existing moral commitments, some of them sort of stemming to kind of Adam Smith era theory of moral sentiment, but otherwise just as kind of a classic view. And why do I talk about economists? Well, because in a way, economists are often brought into this discussion, right? And why do I say that they're consulted as authorities? They give one of the arguments pro. There's a whole other class of arguments that is not economic, but usually to the public, when voters are told what their country's immigration policy will be like, they are usually told that actually this is going to produce great economic benefits for you. It's going to reduce labor costs. It's going to make it's going to make our pension system solvent. It's not studied very often scientifically. And if economists were curious about that, they wouldn't just look at their theoretical model, which amounts to gains from trade and gains from specialization, where it's sort of like, oh, well, if you can make labor cheaper, obviously more wealth is created, right? And then even if your wages, if you maybe reskill to something that's better, or even if your wages go a little bit down, you're also paying a lower price for various goods and services. But I think that model is not true in any single Western country, because as soon as you have immigrants, they do clearly have access to the services that these governments provide. All of the Western world and East Asia are mixed economies with massive amounts of government transfer. So we're talking about something like half of GDP as various forms of government spending. And all of them have basic public services like subsidized healthcare, all sorts of social services, not to mention things like law enforcement and so on. So it's like, the kids of immigrants obviously go to school, they go to public schools in all of these countries. Often they make use of transfers, health services. And the immigrants themselves, they actually retire one day. So let's actually think about this
So they get Social
logically.
Security.
If the average, I mean, yeah, the average age, right, of the laborer is like in their 30s or 40s. You're actually not getting the same amount of working life out of an immigrant before they retire that you do from someone that, say, hits 18 and was growing up in a given country, right? So actually, eventually you're kind of producing an age spike that is perhaps worse than it would have been had you not had immigration. If what you're trying to do is patch up these completely insolvent transfers to the old, such as in Europe, this might be this might be straightforwardly the retirement system. In America, it's Social Security, but there's also indirect mechanisms of transfer. So these go back to some of these topics we've touched in demographics in previous episodes of the problems of the inverted age pyramid and so on and so on. These are, not questions that are that complicated for an economist to grapple with, but they seem always profoundly uninterested in just doing this data driven approach. I think they want to stick to the simple analysis because they basically think that morally, this is what we should do. In a way, the people who make a rights based argument, so the people who just do not like the fact that, individuals' lives are interrupted through the process of deportation, or that individuals' full potential is not developed if they're not allowed to migrate to a more developed or better country, uh, they're more honest, right? They're not laundering their arguments through this perspective as the economists are pretending it's technocratic. So there we actually hit at a different problem. Are countries always stable and always defined to be what they are, and that there is no erosion or undermining or transformation that happens with migration? And you can probably guess that even by posing this question, I think there obviously is a transformation. I think assimilation is kind of fake. I think my most controversial position is assimilation is kind of fake. What actually happens is it's assimilation from both directions, right? When you have new migrants come to the United States, they have always changed the United States, right? When the Midwestern Germans came, 1848, you had that, wave of voters. If you look at a place like Minnesota today, it votes a lot like Scandinavia would vote. So really, I think that when you look at the long-term data, the social attitudes of, say, the first generation of immigrants do differ systematically, but a lot of these differences sort of wash out. In the second and third generation, you often see, this kind of change in the politics, so that often they diverge more than the original immigrants from the pre-existing population. Now, none of this is to say that obviously human migration has not been a huge part of history. It obviously has been. But then the unprecedented scale and speed of it, I think, genuinely endangers political stability. And we can double click on any of those. I just felt it was important to state that outright. And also, yeah, there's some political questions related to the nature of representative government that have never been solved. There's like a tension between a rights based approach and a governance or algorithmic perspective. What the governance perspective is actually, what is the feedback loop of democracy in theory? Well, in theory, the people can dissolve a government and elect a new government. What does it mean when modern governments can, through spending many billions of dollars and through systemic, favor, uh, just import whatever voter they want? And when I say spending billions of dollars, I do mean like, things like, say, putting up refugee claimants in hotels, in prime real estate in New York or London, or any other voting district, right? I mean things like providing services while an inevitable court backlog is there, simple timeouts where if you stay in a country waiting for an answer for a few years, you end up automatically just getting some other pathway to staying or to citizenship. And if this is done systematically, you get situations such as, I don't know, mayoral race in London or in New York, where over 20 years you have such a change of the voting demographic that a different kind of politics becomes possible. Or you have situations where you have systemic fraud that is enabled by a large particular cohort. So it's not immigration in general, it's just a particular community enables significant amounts of fraud, become indispensable politically to the local politicians representing a special interest, a lobby. At that point, sort of the state kind of goes off kilter, right? It becomes very difficult to run it well. And this kind of problem of, can you have a democracy if governments can always import whatever voters they need? And let me be clear, your life always improves from going from third world to first. So it doesn't matter how badly the first world is governed compared to what it used to be, it's still a better life experience. So actually, every new arrival is very happy to be there. And usually they're very happy to have more of their countrymen or more of their family at least be there. So whichever party promises that kind of gets it, get out of get out of good governance free card, right? They're not ever going to be held accountable for any other political decision they make. The only political decision they're going to be held accountable is by this new and recent constituency that can be expanded to the point of 20, 30, or 50% of a relevant city, state, or province. And eventually, I think we're going to reach this point very soon, entire countries.
Fascinating. Are you sympathetic to the sort of analysis that there's like almost a moral hazard involved in terms of like that the desire to bring in in this country sort of a large amount of immigrants during this last presidential cycle was partly politically motivated, or if not largely politically motivated to get more votes?
Undoubtedly.
Yeah.
It at least works out that way. And I'm not doubting people's moral conviction, but anyone who has sort of, the average voter who has this moral conviction, they need to have an answer for how democracy is going to work under conditions of mass immigration, and they don't have an answer. So this is a point that the conservatives do have in their favor, which is that, classical theory of how republics or democracies are supposed to work suggests that citizenship and voting is like a precious right met with equal responsibilities. And that, in fact, um, governments cannot simply manufacture whatever voting base that they need, either through propaganda or through changing the demographics of the voting population through social engineering. And, again, I think this doesn't need to be that complicated. It's sort of like, you go check on Tim Walz in Minnesota, and, I'm sure it's very straightforward. It's like, okay, 95% of Somali Americans in Minnesota vote for us. And their number two issue is immigration, and the number one issue is these government contracts. Well, that's my current constituency. And then normal Minnesotans, well, they vaguely feel good about immigration and they vaguely feel sorry for Somali. Honestly, that's the reality. They feel sorry for Somalians. They think it's like a death sentence to be sent back to Somalia. It's not, but I will acknowledge the liberals do have a point. Your life is worse in Somalia than it is in Minnesota. But, how good is life in Minnesota in the future? And I think, because of this, I think that maybe this is not the right mechanism of international aid. Maybe this is not a good humanitarian mechanism. That would sort of be my synthesis of the, stereotypical liberal position and the stereotypical conservative position, because I am in favor of a richer world, a more developed world. But I think this political problem is borderline catastrophic and will only get more so. And I think all of these countries are risking severe friction in 20, 30, 40 years where, it's not going to save your welfare state if the majority of the voters believe it's illegitimate or don't benefit from it. And it's not going to save your economy if you have a population that is 80% unemployed, right? So it's one thing to have like a Dubai model where workers are not citizens, but no Western country has the, let's say, moral, like the social technology of a different sense of morality where it's acceptable to have long-term residents, multi-generational residents not be citizens. It offends this default Western idea of equality. I mean, maybe, maybe a fair compromise would be to uh, decide that actually, you know what? Residency without welfare, that's actually a fair economic trade. But to make republics work, you kind of have to have a longer term stake in the country. But that feels like such a big intellectual and ideological project. I feels like way too optimistic to think the West can develop this. So ironically, I think immigration is going to be geopolitically great for for Gulf Arab monarchies. It's probably going to be great for places like Singapore. And so far, economically and geopolitically, it's going to reduce the coherence of Western countries and their ability to compete with countries such as China.
Yeah. And so what is the right way of reconciling these sort of political tensions that you bring up? If we were asking you for advice on how to handle it, in this country, how might we think about it?
I mean, I think one of the first steps would be to be statistically honest about what's happening and gather relevant information. One of the reasons why, the earlier study that I alluded to was a Danish study. And Denmark is interesting because, you know, here's my good news. The good news I always tell my social democratic and liberal friends is the following: you like a good welfare state and you dislike populists in power, you can just be immigration restrictionist. This one weird trick to prevent populists from coming to power is just slow the pace of immigration, which is what they did in Denmark on the basis of accurately published information. This was not in reality making the state more solvent. It was making it more insolvent because depending on country of origin and the educational composition of the immigrants, often they would be a net drain on the welfare state, not a net gain. And they just acted on this information. And somehow the internal politics of the center left and the left in Denmark allowed them to do that. And I think that on the other side of it, I'm not sure populists actually can reduce immigration that much because the small business lobby in almost all countries favors cheap labor. But the problem is 20% of the people you import, from the rest of the world that you allow to settle will end up being cheap labor and basically a handout to the small businesses, be they like tourism businesses in Croatia or truckers in Poland or truckers in Canada, right? They get to have, the business owners get to have cheaper labor. But then you have all of these additional voters. So it's kind of weird where conservatives in the typical Western coalition, when they have small business owners and some large businesses too, they will have an inbuilt pro labor lobby. And sometimes this is branded skilled immigration, like the case with Silicon Valley favors H-1B1 visas. But in other cases, it's really not. It's like seasonal labor. It's sort of the classic argument of, well, but who's going to pick the strawberries, right? And so, really, it's not about skilled versus unskilled. It's literally about, hey, cheaper labor means better economic productivity. It means better profits for me. And that totally has a place. It's just the case that I think that in practice, I have not seen a Western country differentiate between the economically productive and non productive. So, the economic argument then ends up being these companies benefit and their profit margin at the expense of making society as a whole poorer because the political economy is shifted towards redistribution and towards more corruption and towards less functional government, right? So I think these things are all connected. It's sort of like, what's the point of this particular company has 20% better profit margins if, say, Minnesota has to then hike taxes for all businesses for 10% to pay for learning centers, the famous type of the learning center, or for Armenian hospices where there are no patients in LA. I don't think you can really argue. This is like free riding, right? It might actually be great for that particular company, but it's going to be bad for the politics of the state, and it's going to be bad for macroeconomic performance of a state. And I think this, I don't think we have many people with a good incentive to solve this problem. Like even the populace themselves, right? Because if they enforce immigration and they're loud about it.
Some people sort of make this other argument. They say, hey, um, we don't have the talent, uh, in our country, and thus the talent that we need to really compete, and thus we need to be sort of, canvassing the world for the most talented people, almost like an NBA draft or something, and proactively recruiting the best and the brightest, and just making it as easy as possible for the top 1%, top 0.01% to be in this country. That's a different sort of debate, and I'm curious what you think about it.
Well, if we were to truly limit it to the exceptional talent of the world, I think if you had like a strong yearly limit that it's sort of like, okay, the United States is going to take in 100,000 people and only 100,000 people, and we're going to just have it be a competition, and we're going to scout these people, and you will have to argue for why this person read and this other person is, talented enough to enter. I think that could possibly work. The problem is no one has really set such hard limits, and no one has sort of produced like a tournament mechanism or a, almost college admissions like mechanism. The closest I can think of is sort of the Swiss naturalization process, where they basically have like, essentially like local community and stakeholders vote on the naturalization of particular citizens coming, particular residents. Um, I think usually the argument is, oh, we'll find some objective measure of the quality, right? We'll have, say, what Canada used to have, which probably worked decently well, a points-based admission system, where you're like, oh, if you have a bachelor's or a master's or doctorate. The problem is Goodhart's law kicks in. So as soon as you have an accurate or claimed to be accurate objective measure, that objective measure is gamed in the case of degrees through degree mills, right? And well, then the number of people coming in increases. And then there are all these attached mechanisms. I think that the core idea that there are a few thousand extremely talented people in the world that you want in your country doing great things is true. My only question is, are we really debating that? Or is that almost like, I'm not going to say it's a straw man. That's not quite fair. I do not know of a country that does not accept a few thousand exceptional people. We think of China as a very, very closed country. But top American talent, including the leader, the CEO of Anthropic, right, Dario Amodei, he worked at Baidu. He led a team at Baidu just fine. So, okay, China in the 2010s could accept top American AI scientists to work at their tech giants just fine. Well, okay, then let's say, and China is not a welcoming place for Westerners necessarily, but the mechanisms exist. So my question is sort of, are these mechanisms deficient? Well, in some sense, they must be. There are many people who could contribute, who tried their very best to go through this whole process. I certainly understand this process. I understand how difficult it is, how frustrating it is, no matter how good your argument is, that you're frankly contributing economically or technologically or intellectually or culturally. So it has all the frustrations of the DMB, except you're dealing with your life, not just your car. Um, but I think that maybe it's impossible to set up a bureaucracy that actually allows 100% of the people who should be in the country to come in, without not also letting in, say, you know, a huge number of people who probably should not. So that's sort of my take here. It's like actually almost all countries in the world have some intake for talent. Most of these countries do not need to explicitly hunt for talent. People just try to go where it makes sense. They're recruited by the companies. So I think there should be some relatively expensive options for companies to get peak labor. I think concepts like the investor visa, let's say Austria or Portugal have, make sense. I think the way to do it would be perhaps to have a talent hunting agency explicitly designed where imagine the following. It's a bureaucracy. It's set up in a Western government, and its goal is to find 2,000 of the most promising people in the world. And then the mandate of the agency as well, they can stamp you a visa, like 2,000 visas a year, 2,000 residencies, permanent residencies. Let's not have it be a visa, just make it a permanent residency. But more than that, they can, on your behalf, go and shop you around and offer you as someone to hire to top companies in your country if the companies are willing to sponsor them, and if you have suggested them, and if you have identified them as top talent in your field. That's actually a very strong offer. Can you imagine the US government or the British government or the Japanese government emailing you or sending you a letter saying, actually, you know what? We've identified you as top talent. If you choose to move, here's your residency card. And actually, here's this statement letter of intent from this top company or this top university to employ you. I actually think that would have a great ratio. And I think you could proactively get the best talent. But again, note how small these numbers are, 2,000 people. And then any sort of argument to expand it to 20,000, it's hard to resist because 20,000 people would mean that the bureaucrats get to do even more of that. So I don't know, perhaps there should be a DARPA of talent where you don't get to permanently work there. You're appointed for 1 to 2 years. Your title is Director of American Talent or something like that. And your literal job for 2 years, and you can only do it for 2 years, is to nominate like 50 people. And then that's it. And then you go, right? I think that could work very well. And I don't know, maybe being a venture capitalist would be, good training for this. Or maybe it can be a credential in venture capital. Say, oh, I was an American director of talent in DC, global talent, and now I want to join this VC firm. I think VC firms, once that institution got a good reputation, those VC firms would probably hire people like that. Like that sounds like a good skill set, no?
Totally. And so I have a broader question, which is, this all makes sense. Is this the right question to think about, like, what's the optimal population size for something in the United States? Of course, Matt Iglesias had his book, 1,000 Americans. And of course, the conversation they don't like to have, is like, which people and, and what do they do, et cetera. But what is the right way of thinking about this kind of like, optimal population size?
I think optimal population size is a difficult topic. It's actually easier to have optimal population pyramid where, ideally you want as young a population as possible, but not children. That's economically optimal. And then at the very least, you don't want an inverted age pyramid. I believe no country so far has actually managed to achieve what is theoretically possible, which is to stabilize a low fertility rate with immigration, especially because the numbers get crazy. If your TFR is on the high end, if it's like 1.9 total fertility rate or 2, you can probably get young people coming to the country. And I think, for example, Poland's demographics were somewhat improved when a big refugee wave of relatively young people came from Ukraine during the war. The pensioners didn't leave Ukraine. The young men actually could not leave Ukraine. So it was just a wave of young women and their children. And that slightly improved it. But it's very hard to plan something like that, right? So Poland has a large population of relatively young Ukrainian workers, et cetera, et cetera. And that probably worked out for Poland, though Poland, was not planning, obviously, for Putin to invade Ukraine. But I think the optimal population size, the truth is, in a modern industrial economy, a large population is better. So even if this cuts against the sort of all these points I made about how these systems are abused or difficult to control, all else equal, you want more people in your country. It's actually almost always better, right? There are a few strange cases where, say, Mexico and India, right? India always pairs in its international trade negotiations. So when you heard about the recent trade deal between the EU and India, I guarantee you attached to that trade deal was an easing of migration from India to Europe. Why? Because remittances are actually a great source of foreign currency for governments. And some countries, again, such as Somalia, it's sort of like the remittances ended up being like the equivalent of 30% of Somali GDP, depending on what measure you take. And again, even for countries that are more developed, like Mexico, that has some industry, has petrochemicals, has agriculture, even if the agriculture, even if the avocado farms are owned by the cartels, they still export a lot of agricultural products. It's still like a real economy. Even there, remittances from a truly rich country like the United States can be very, very good. And on the other hand, though, if China just had 600 million people rather than 1.2 billion, how much worse would its economics really be? I think the answer is not much. I think what China truly benefits from is these like mega cities that are well governed, right? And look, a China of 600 million people could still allow 50 million people to live in the greater Shenzhen area just fine, right? Or a Japan of 70 million people can still have a Tokyo of 20 to 30 million people, actually. It's just the rest of the country empties out. And in fact, in Japan, we do see this. The secondary and tertiary population centers empty out into the largest cities available, and most of all, empty out into Tokyo. So again, it's sort of with the United States, I think in the US, the case for population growth would be actually much improved. And I do mean population growth either from natural increase or from immigration if America's largest cities were governed well, because then the real agglomeration effects would kick in. Industry is regional. It's very concentrated. You have a many layers deep ecosystem in Shenzhen for every physical product under the sun. And in Silicon Valley, you have many layer deep, ecosystem for anything you can imagine related to starting a startup, financing it, recruiting for it, etc. Right? To give a different effect. Or in New York, you have a network effect related to finance and so on and so on. The cities have to be large and have to function well, and then population growth makes your country richer. Yes, adding even more medium-sized cities, I think that does something for GDP. It certainly develops parts of the country. It prevents infrastructure, such as what you see in Detroit when a city is abandoned from falling into disuse. So in a way, it's making more use of existing capital. But I don't believe it is improving global competitiveness, right? To improve global competitiveness, industrial zones and centers are developed. So this is one of the reasons where if the industrial policy of a country like UAE ever started working, their sort of laissez-faire immigration without welfare and without voting, I think that might actually make them immensely wealthy. And then there's the final problem. Well, it's like pick, which is it? Are we about to achieve post-scarcity through the abolition of the value of human labor driven by artificial intelligence? Or are we going to need hundreds of millions of more workers? Like, I think it's one or the other, right? So if you're saying, oh, the birth rate doesn't matter because AI automates all jobs, then you can also go the other way and say, actually, immigration doesn't matter. The AI will do all jobs. Actually, we might want to reduce the population a little bit. We might want to like export everyone who's less productive than the AI. Can you imagine that? A country that gets ever richer as the population shrinks. It just has a yearly IQ test or something like that. And if you're dumber than the AI, you get deported. The UBI keeps going up, right? At the end of it, the 50 humans left can all be trillionaires.
Yeah.
And you might think this is a total joke, but we have dynamics like this. Tribes in the United States, once they are federally acknowledged, police their membership because they have an incentive to limit the government, essentially, to limit the sort of like relevant government when attached to a source of income, such as, I don't know, like a casino or something, right? The fewer members of a nation, of a First Nation or of a tribe, the fewer people to distribute this fixed income to. And the Saudi monarchy and the Gulf monarchies until very recently had the exact same system where, the amount of oil you pump out of the ground is going to be the same. So be it casino money, oil out of the ground, or boon from AI, actually the incentives flip to labor, to citizens being a liability rather than an asset. I don't think industrial society is done needing human labor, to be clear. I actually think we still need it. But if you truly believe that within 2 years or 5 years human labor is obsolete, then you should be intellectually honest and acknowledge there is no economic argument for increasing the population, right? So if you're anti-birth, you have to, then at least you're anti-immigration on practical grounds. Maybe you think actually it's the duty of American-made AI to provide benevolent money to everyone on the planet. But if that's the argument and your AI is the super intelligent God thing, they can do that without U.S. immigration policy, okay? Like that's going to happen anyway. If the AI think is the right thing to do, maybe the AI will just write super persuasive writing for AI controlled USAID, and we'll reboot USAID, and it won't be corrupt this time. It'll just be a UBI check writing facility for the entire planet. It'll employ no humans, and it'll just be driven by AI. But no one really makes these arguments because I think these commitments are not systemic. They're affect based and they're coalition based, and they're not really systematic thinking based. But they're fun to think about. Honestly, we should write more political science fiction. That would be like the AI of USAID would be a fun. It will be a fun story. It's sort of like, we achieved Doge through firing all government workers, and it's all down by AI, but the AI is Claude. So Claude just, efficiently distributes effective altruism style dole to the planet's population. Like that's a fun science fiction story.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll happen, but it's a fun science fiction story.
And you're on the belief more that like you're more bullish on labor or the need for population, ongoing in a world of AI?
I think AI is going to have a long on ramp, and it's going to take a lot of effort to train it for specific things. So if you want to call me, like, let's say I'm bullish on AI and I'm modestly skeptical on true AGI. That is AGI that can control a robot that moves through physical space. And I think even if you have AGI, right, we should not underestimate the value of us being embodied intelligences. So even if up there on the up there on the cloud, Claude or ChatGPT or Grok are geniuses beyond reckoning. They're still up there in the cloud. And I'm still here with my two hands and with my eyes and with my perception in this minute. Will they be able to do everything better in spreadsheets? Sure. But I think the number of physical tasks that humans will have will actually be like, pretty reasonable. And also at the end of the day, like there is this aspect of human intelligence that we've not yet reproduced. Like, in fact, we have not reproduced even the limits of, say, what a human writer can do. Sure, it's gotten very good at code, but I don't see many software engineers be fired yet. Do you? Like, the layoffs are very minor and they kind of stopped. Like, software engineers still come to this city and still get work.
Yeah.
Like new jobs, new startups. New startups still hire. I think that's the big sign that it's extremely powerful. And until the moment where it automates 100% of a software developer's job, and software developers will be the first ones hit, every single moment until that point, it makes the remaining labor of the software engineer even more valuable.
Is there anything related to the immigration topic that we haven't yet gotten into?
I think that in the near future, immigration politics will change. It's only a question of which countries will be ready for it, because the planet is going through global graying. So I actually believe there will be an intense competition for talent. There'll be an intense competition for talent, but as the welfare system becomes truly insolvent, and I don't say this with glee, right? Like I actually, I grew up, in an Eastern European country. I grew up in a country that basically had, some sense of safety, like welfare in that sense. The idea was that, you could get a free education, free healthcare, all of that stuff, all these classic things, right? That say a Democratic Party median voter would want for the United States. I can see the value of that and living in that, but the numbers don't lie. This thing is just actually insolvent. So as that insolvency hits, a lot of countries, some of them will have this autocatalytic reaction, but in others, people are going to do what Denmark has done. And they're going to be like, actually, we don't want to be a full libertarian economic thunderdome, even if that makes us a bit more productive. Actually, we're going to try to balance the books. And the easiest thing, which voters will accept first, is, sort of slowing down who gets to claim these benefits. So eventually, in the extreme, Norway, to give a country with oil, in the extreme, 20 years from now, Norway, first off, it's going to be more Islamic than it is today for sure. It will be multicultural. But even those multicultural voters in 20 years in Norway benefiting from the Sovereign Wealth Fund, they might start to converge with UAE. They might start to converge towards an anti-immigration stance from the progressive, from the sort of let's balance the budget perspective. So yeah, my take would be the global labor market is graying and it's downskilling. So the total number of highly skilled people who are well educated in the world, I think we probably, if we've not hit peak, I think we probably hit the peak of that this year. Like I would believe 10 years ago, I would believe that many Indians do not have the education they could have. But today, I actually think that, I actually believe India has made enough progress that many people from India who are capable of developing talent have developed it. Their university system has actually improved, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, there's more that can be done in, say, places like Nigeria, but there's no next China, right? India was the next China, the billion-plus people country that is going to be a huge reserve of new engineering talent or new scientific talent or new cultural talent. Africa's population is actually very small, even after it grows compared to that. And even if Africa grows and if it develops its universities, China will be decline, India will be in decline, the Western world will be in decline in terms of population. I think we kind of hit peak talent this year, plus minus 5 years.
Yeah.
Like peak human talent. And that's an interesting topic too.
Yeah.
What does it mean for human talent is, limited supply and decreasing supply of human talent at the same time when AI is starting to take off? I think AI might actually supercharge labor costs. And I don't think I've seen anyone else predict that, where it's sort of like the AI is advancing, but not fast enough. And the pool of human talent is shrinking. So the compensation for the most talented humans is going to keep going up. Jevons paradox plus supply constraints from the womb, not from immigration policy.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I'll bring up another sort of line of thinking that a very niche subculture has had for some time. Some version of real life idiocracy, in the sense of the basic argument is people as they modernize and have fewer kids, and more intelligent people tend to modernize, or more intelligent cultures tend to have fewer kids. And so there was this question of, hey, is there this idiocracy playing out where people who have lower IQs are having more children, and does that do anything to affect sort of the global IQ? Is there any sort of resonance or sense of reality to those arguments, or should that be a concern?
I think it's very hard to measure global IQs. I would not discount these arguments, and I completely reject anyone who says that these are illegitimate to discuss. So I believe these should be discussed. We should straightforwardly measure them. We should figure out the genetics of intelligence. But I think a cultural variant of this is what I find more interesting. I think it is true. I think there's a version of this where the cultures that are best at reproducing themselves, either through assimilation or straightforward reproduction today, are actually cultures that are in some ways anti-modern. And most of the positives of economic development, technology progress, they come from modern cultures that are failing to reproduce and are more and more also failing to assimilate. So eventually there's a tipping point where the dominant global culture is no longer modern or modernism. And I mean this in this kind of like high developed industrial orderly society. let's put it this way, we might have hit peak first world, and whatever is the genetic basis or is not the genetic basis of those cultures themselves are overdetermined to sort of start shrinking. So yeah, in a way, a version of Idiocracy will be true. It could look exotic though. The Amish are not very modern. They don't strike us as third world. They don't strike us as particularly stupid, but they're not as economically productive as, say, Taiwan. Yet the future is going to have more Somalia, more Amish, more ultra religious groups, and so on, and it'll have fewer Taiwans. And then, people who like the output of modernity have to reckon with that.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining. It's been a fascinating conversation, all things
Thank
immigration. And until next time.
Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries.